Hi there once again and welcome to another Expresso mechanic tutorial. And in this one we're going to be building what you can see on the screen, which is of course a rig for a human eye. I was recently contacted by Philippe Lebray or Lebret. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce your name, but anyway, it's one or the other. But anyway, Philippe contacted me and said that he was doing a little bit of work on an eye rig himself, and he wondered if I could sort of do a bit more and perhaps point him in the right direction for actually getting it completely working the way he wanted it to, because he wanted it to be controlled by light, as in the intensity of the light, and also the distance between the light and the eye itself. So I set about doing some work on that, and once I'd actually built the rig I thought that it would actually make quite a good tutorial. So a shout out goes to you, Philippe, for giving me the idea for this one. But anyway, that's what we're going to be doing in this tutorial. But before we continue, I do want to bring your attention to something. Now, if we just click on here, this tutorial that I've got on the screen now on YouTube, this is for modeling and also texturing an eyeball. This is a truly superb tutorial. I'm only going to be going through really rigging this, but if you wish to know how to create convincing textures, and I do mean convincing, for your eyeball, this tutorial, I really cannot recommend it highly enough. It's an absolute joy. Fantastic stuff. So please do check this out. So it's a COPO tutorial, and you can see the title on the screen there. Okay, so let's just go back to Cinema, and if we bring up the picture viewer, you can see the results that you get from this tutorial. Superb, really, really superb. So yeah, do check that one out if you wish to texture this thing. But anyway, that's what we're going to be about in this tutorial. So without further ado, let's see if we can make this happen. We'll start by bringing in a sphere, and our radius, I'm going to make this the same size as the COPO tutorial in case you do decide to go there and do this. He made it just simply 1.2 centimeters, and that's very, very small. So we'll hit O to zoom in on it, and we'll change the segments to 24. We'll also change our display to garage shading lines so that we can see what we're doing. Okay, I think what we'll do is just orientate this slightly differently. If we say -90 in the rotation P, that orientates it the way we'd like to see it, and we'll also move it slightly. So we'll say 1.2. I need to move it 1.2, don't I? Yeah, that's fine. So then it just sits where the floor would be. I'm not going to bother to put a floor in, but you may if you wish to. But anyway, we've got the eye set up and it's ready to go. What we can do now is make it editable, and then we can think about doing some editing. So we'll switch to edge mode. The first thing we're going to do, in fact, I'll switch to polygon mode first because we need to remove some polys. So we can say UL and select these and just remove them, and that will be our pupil. And then we can switch to edge mode, UL again, select these, and we can just bring them back in slightly. Just bring them back to just slightly deeper than them being level with this edge, so that we get this fong break here. Okay, so we've got that far. The next thing to do with the sphere selected is to hold down the Option key and drop this into a subdivision surface. So we'll do that. And straight away we can see that this hard edge, this fong break here, is no longer there. Everything is smoothed out. Well, we still want that there. So the way to do this is to weight it. So MR, that will allow us to weight the subdivision surface. But before we do that, we need to UL, select this here, and then MR to weight the hypernerbs, and we can just click and drag, and you can see that that comes back and it's brought back that hard edge, and that's exactly what we want, and the rest of this is nice and smooth. So that's perfect. That's given us the setup for the eye, and that's exactly what we need it to look like. Before we move on, what I will do is actually show you a technique that Philippe was using in order to create an iris for himself, and I looked at it and I had to play around with it, and I found that I thought that this would be the definitive way to do it, the way I'm doing it here, because I'm going to be using a Pose Morph to actually move this. But let's just take a look at his technique, because I think it's worth showing you, because it could be useful elsewhere. So let's just bring in another sphere, make this 1.2. We'll leave the segments at 16 for this, it doesn't really matter, and we'll move it 1.2 so that it's level with our other sphere. Just move it along and we'll reorientate it again, -90, and then we'll make it editable. We'll scale it, so we'll select object mode and we'll just, or model mode I should say, and we'll just scale it in the Y so that we get something that's more or less a flat disk. Go to about there, that'll be okay. Go back into poly mode and UL to select these, remove them, and these and remove them. So this is what he's set up. Now, in order to make this work, he dropped it into a Spherify. So let's see if we can find one of those. Here it is, the Spherify. Drop that in there and drop it down here, and we'll make it the same sort of size. We'll make its radius 1.2, and we'll make sure that it fits to parent. So we'll do that. We need to do some adjustments. Just take it out of there, and we'll make this 1.2 once again so that it is exactly the right size. Drop it back in. And now you can see that it's already starting to work. And if we adjust this, you can see that his idea was actually pretty good. And it does actually work. But I didn't think it was appropriate for this particular job, and you'll see why. But that is a very clever idea. I would never have thought to use a Spherify to do this. It's a very, very clever technique, and it could be useful elsewhere. So I thought that that was just worth sharing. But anyway, let's just delete that because we're not going to be using it. But yeah, fantastic idea, Philippe. Okay, we're ready to start work then and think about how we're going to actually make this iris here, or rather the pupil, I suppose I should say, dilate and close. So let's just see what we're going to do. So with our sphere selected, we can say UL, go back into edge mode and select this edge, because this is of course the outer rim of our pupil, so it's the edge that we need to work with. Now we need to get a hold of our scale tool, so if we just click here we can do that. And now what we can do is just lock the y-axis and we can bring these two out to around here. So that's our eye, or our pupil of our eye, fully open. The next thing we can worry about is what we're going to do. So with the sphere selected, what we'll add is a rigging tag, and it will be a Pose Morph tag. And what we'll be interested in actually is points. So we'll go to points mode for this, UL, select these points, and in our Pose Morph here we can say points, and we're ready to go. So our base pose is the pose that we've got now. This is going to be our base pose. So what we're interested in is defining our pose 0, and that's what we're going to do next. So what we'll do again, select our scale tool and we'll bring this down until it's where we think it needs to be closed, which is going to be somewhere around there. And then if we now select our Pose Morph, we can see that we've got the result that we want. Okay, so that's how we're going to be operating our pupil, making it close and making it open. Fantastic. And that just about completes this tutorial, because that's what I wanted to show you. I had you going there for a minute, didn't I? You really thought I was going to bring the tutorial to an end, but no, I'm not going to, because we've got to do a bit more work. And the next thing we're going to worry about is how we're going to make this thing operate. And to do that, we're going to be using Expresso. Before we reach for the Expresso, we'll just come back to model mode here and zoom out a little bit, and then drop a light into the scene, because of course that's going to be the thing we're going to use to control all of this. So we'll drop a light in there. We'll just move it. Let's just make it 1.2 so that it's level with the eye, and then we'll bring it back so that it's lighting the scene. We'll just leave it there. It's not fully lighting it, but we need more light than this, but we'll leave it like that for now because that's fine for what we need. Okay, great. So we've got our light. We'll call it actually C light for controller light. And we'll move on from here. We'll bring in another null, rename it Expresso, and we'll give it the Expresso tag. We've got the editor open and we're ready to start work. The first thing we can do is bring in our light. And at the output stage, we need to select intensity. That's what we're going to need. So we've got it in the photometric control here, and we'll select that. Okay, that's great. So let's see what's coming out of there. Let's get a result node and see what we actually get. So we'll plumb this in here. And we can see we've got 1000 there. Let's select our light, go into our general controls here and bring this down. Now that's not the correct intensity. So we need to find the correct one. That's confusing. I mean, I've shown you that deliberately because that's not the one. So it's the general. We want the general controls. And that does make sense because we've got the general controls here. But don't go into the photometric and select the intensity from there. Definitely go into the general tab and select from there. So we want the intensity here, and we should be able to drop this in and find that we get 1. And that's what we want. Because when we're at 100, that's going to be the value of 100%. So it's 1 because everything is done between 0 and 1 internally in Cinema 4D with regard to intensity and of course color values. Okay, so that's what we're interested in using. So we'll take that away from there, leave our result in case we need it for something else. Now, if we wish to, what we can do is grab a hold of our Pose Morph here, and in our tag properties, we want Pose 0 strength. We can simply connect these two together. And if we then play around with our light, we should find that we get some motion. But at the moment we don't. And the reason for that, let's just take a quick look. The reason for it is actually quite simple. It's because we're still in edit mode. We must put it in animate mode. And now you can see that we're getting the result. So if you don't get the result, make sure you check to see whether you're in animate mode, okay? That's very, very important. So now that we're at 100%, we can see that our pupil is fully closed. And if we drop back to 0, we can see that it's all behaving correctly via the intensity of the light. So that's working as we need it to. But anyway, we're going to do a lot more work before we get to the stage of connecting up our Pose Morph's strength. So let's just space things out a little bit and think about where we're going to go from here. So we've got our light and we know that we can use the intensity. But we also said that we wanted to use the distance as well. So when we move this away, we want the pupil to actually open slightly. And it will be slightly. This is going to be a very subtle effect. So how are we going to do this? Well, what we're going to do is bring in our sphere. So we've got this here. And what we're going to do is give this a global position port. And we're also going to do the same with this light. So we'll give this light a global position port. So we've got two things coming out of the output stage. So those are set up and they're ready to go. Now the next thing we need is a distance node. So we'll calculate and it will be distance. And we can plumb these two in here. Okay. And that will tell us the distance that the light is away from the eye, or the centre of the eye. So we're currently 3.9 centimetres away. And if we move, we can see that it increases. Okay, so that's what we're going to be using in order to calculate our distance from the eye. That's fine, and we're ready to go on that score. And again, we could use that to plumb into here, but we won't, because of course it will cause a problem at the moment because it's too big a number that's coming out of there. We want a number between 0 and 1. And the way that we're going to achieve that is with range mappers, and we're also going to be using conditions in order to make sure that we don't exceed it. That's going to be the next thing that we're going to do. So let's just zoom in at 100%. Okay, so let's think about where we're going next. The next thing we need are actually two range mappers, so let's get those in. calculate range mapper. We've got our first one, command drag to create our second one. Our intensity can be plumbed into our top range mapper. And then we can think about what we're going to put in there. Well, we don't actually have to change anything. We've got 0, 1 and 0, 1, and that's exactly what we need. But what we need to do is add the spline. So we're just going to add a couple of points, twirl down, and we're going to start working on here. Now, this is at 0.25, which is fine. We want this one to be minus 0.25. So let's sort that out, minus 0.25. And that's great. So we've got our spline ready to go. And that's the only changes I say that we need to make in there. We can clamp our upper and lower values, but there's no need to do that because we're actually going to be using a compare and conditions. So we'll leave that as it is. The next thing we can do is plumb the output of our distance into our bottom range mapper. And we can think about what we're going to put in here. Now our bottom range mapper will be set up slightly different. So what we've got to do in our input lower, we'll put 2. So in other words, we want our light to start at 2 centimeters away from the center of the eye. That's going to be our minimum distance. And our maximum distance we're going to say is 20. So our input upper will be 20. So at distances between 2 and 20 centimeters, that's where we want the range mapper to be operating. We then need to work out what we're going to put in our lower value. Well, that will be 0.1. And our output upper will be 0. So we're going to be using tiny values here, very tiny values, just to make subtle differences to this. And that's all I want to do. Okay, so that's our range mappers set up. What we'll do next is put some compares in here so that we can put some restrictions in. So let's see what we can do here. So if we get a compare here, let's get a logic compare. We've got our first one. I'm going to command drag to create a second. I'm going to plumb the output of my first range mapper into my top compare. And all I need to say here is greater than, and it will be 1. So we don't want to exceed 1. The same is going to be true of this range mapper. So greater than 1. Now I'm not going to connect this up yet because there's something I've got to do before we can do that. Just move this out of the way. I need an add node or a math node, but it needs to be set up with add as the function, so we don't need to change anything here. And all we need to do is add the output of this range mapper to the output of this range mapper. And then the output of here can be plumbed into the compare. So when these two are added together, they must not exceed 1. That's what we're saying there. Great. We can then worry about bringing in 2 conditions. That's the next port of call for us. So let's bring in 1. We've got it there. We can command drag once again to create a second. Our output from our compare at the top here will be switching our condition here. Now, what we need to do is actually plumb the output of our compare here into our second condition. And we need the output of our math node here to be plumbed in here. And the bottom value can be 1. Okay, so what we're saying really is if we exceed 1, we make our condition produce a number 1. That's what's going to happen there. So once we're greater than 1, we're going to switch to here and we'll make this 1. So we're forcing a situation where our range mappers and everything else associated with this part of the expression cannot produce a value that exceeds 1. That's the essential thing that we're doing here. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. And the reason we're doing that, because here, even though we're saying 0.1 to 0, it can exceed 0.1 because we're not clamping the values. So that's why we're doing that. Now this compare here, We've already set this up. So what we've got to do next is plumb in what we're going to do with this, with the inputs and outputs. We know that input 3 will be 1 because we've said we didn't want this to exceed 1. So let's plumb this in here. And that's the logical part of that done. That's all we need to do, because neither compare, or rather neither condition, can now exceed 1. So that's fantastic. Now, if we wish to, we can connect the Pose Morph now, and this will work. So again, if we get into our light here and we move this, we can see that it does work. And also we can move the light here, and there will be a difference. It's going to be a very, very subtle difference, but in actual fact, you can just about see it. It is tiny, but you can just about see it. I mean, if we get a lot of our coordinates here and we move this to -20, we can see that that has opened the pupil. And if we bring it back to -2, we can see that it has slightly closed. So that's doing its job. However, if we were to animate this, it would scream, "This is computer graphics," because as we move our light or we change the intensity of our light, the eye or the pupil will react instantly. Now that's not the way a human eye works. When the light increases in brightness, there's always a slight delay before the pupil reacts. Now, that's something that I think we need to put in. So we'll move this Pose Morph over here and we'll bring in, what we want is a memory node. So we'll bring one of those in. Now, what we need to do is, in our input, we'll plumb the output of the condition. And then finally, we can plumb the output of the memory node into the Pose Morph. And now we've got to think about our history depth and our history level. Our history depth, I'm going to make 20 because I found that it was quite a sweet spot. But we're going to do some more work with some user data as well so that we can actually alter this. That's the next thing we're going to do. That's the thing that we're going to do to finish this off, actually. You don't even have to do that, but I thought I'd put it in because it just allows you that extra bit of art direction. And I'm big on art direction. I think it's important. So we've got the history depth of 20, and we're going to say 19 for the history level because it always needs to be at least 1 less than the history depth. And now, if we were to animate this, we'll find that we get a delay with the pupil. So if we get a hold of our light and we start moving this, we can see that there is a slight delay. If you knock it around, you can see that there is a slight delay. You see it better if we do some keyframe animation, and we'll do that at the end of the tutorial just to finish everything off. But that's fine. That's given us our first expression. If we just hit H so that we can see everything, that's our basic first expression. There's going to be a bit more, as I say, because I'm going to do some user data next. We're going to be creating that, and we're going to be using it to control the actual memory nodes, history depth and history level. So that's just what we're going to be doing just to finish off. Let's just shut this Expresso editor down. Bring in another null, call it control. And then we can think about adding some user data. So we'll add user data. Straight away, I'll create a group, pull it away from the user data there, call it control, and the data above it we can drop in there. Rename this history depth, and it will be a float data type. We'll want a float slider for the interface, a real value for the unit. Steps of 1 is fine because we want them to be integers. And we can then set our numbers. Probably, well, you can leave it at 0, but I'll put 5 in the minimum and 30 in the max. These numbers are completely subjective. You can change them to whatever numbers you feel suit you best. So we'll clamp those values and then hit OK. And then we've got control and history depth. We've got exactly what we want. And we can move this and it will do its job. Fantastic. So we've got that there. The next thing we can do is think about how we're going to be using this. Now, what we can do, we'll come into here first. Now, let's just grab a hold of this memory node and think about what we're doing here. So we've got the history depth and we've got the history level. We're going to want to work with these two with our control that we've just created. So what we'll do in order to do this, we need to drag in the memory operator because we can't get to these here. So we'll drag in the memory node operator, drag that in. And then in here, we've got history level. And we've also got in the node properties history depth. So we can bring the two of those in. And we'll just place the history depth at the top. So that's ready to go. And then we can think about bringing the control in. And at the output stage, control history depth. So we've got that. This can be plumbed directly into here. But we know that our history level must always be one value lower, at least one value lower than the history depth. So we need another math node. We'll copy this one, change the function to subtract, and we'll subtract 1 from our history depth. And then we can plumb this into the history level. And that gives us the setup for that. Now, while this will work, if we do some keyframe animation, what we'll find when we reset back to 0, we'll get a lag and we'll have to double click in order to get the eye to react and go back to its initial setting. That's going to be a problem for us. So we don't want these 3 in here. What we need to do is select our Expresso null, come down to our programming tags and add another Expresso so that we've got this one here. And this is the order they need to be in. This one needs to be first, followed by this one. Okay. So what we need to do is grab a hold of these 3, Command X to take them out of there, select this, click in the background, Command V to put them back. So we're going to use 2 Expresso expressions to make this happen. So they're in there and they're ready to go, and we just need to add some more nodes now to think about what we're going to do. So we can add a time node, and as always, delete the time port, add a frame port. So we've got that there. Get a compare and leave it as equal to in the function, and we can plumb our frame into input 1 and it will be equal to 0 because that's what we're going to be interested in. Okay, so when we're equal to 0, we basically want to reset our history depth, and that's what we're going to do next, and we're going to be bringing in a couple more nodes to do that. What we need are 2 conditions, so we'll bring those in, bring one in, Command drag to copy, and all we need to do is place these between the math subtract and the actual control here. So we'll bring them over here, just bring these down here somewhere, put these up here, just unplumb these 2, and our output from our compare will be the switch, so we'll plumb those like that. And then our conditions here, all we need to do is plumb the history depth from our control in there and the output of the subtract into the bottom condition, and then these can be connected up like this. And the outputs here, or the second inputs I should say, the input number 3s actually, they can both contain 0. That's absolutely fine. Okay, and that finishes that expression off, and that's all of the Expresso now taken care of. So that completes everything, and this will reset everything when we're back to 0. Fantastic, so we'll close this down, and then we can think about perhaps just doing a little bit of keyframing here just to show how this works. If we just select our light here, our control light, we can see that our position dead is -2.7. Let's make that -2. And we'll record it there. And if we just take our timeline, we'll just drag this over to here so that we've got 30 frames to play with. So in other words, we're doing this over a period of 1 second. What we'll do is move this back to -20 and we'll record there. So let's see what happens now. So if we play the timeline, we can see that there is a short delay and the pupil opens. If we go back to 0, we reset to our initial position because of the way that we've got things set up. Let's just play that again. So you can see that there is a definite delay and then that pupil reacts, and that's exactly what we want to happen. So we've got our eye at 30. Let's just go through to, say, 45 frames, and we'll record our light's intensity, which is at 70%. So we'll record it there and then move through to, let's go to 90 frames. We'll add some more frames actually, we'll make this 300. But we'll go through to 90 frames and then we'll increase the intensity to 100% and record there. And let's just see what happens now. So we're going to open a little bit and then we're going to close because we've increased the intensity. So we're closing to there. And then I think what we'll do next, we'll just go through to, say, 120 frames. We'll record the intensity there. And then at, say, 160 frames, what we'll do is lower the intensity down to around 20%. And we'll see what happens now. So let's play through. Slightly open, slightly closed, and very much open now. So we're wide open. We've come to a stage where we're wide open, and because we're actually a large distance away, we're probably slightly more open than we would be if we were closer. So that's all fine. That's all working perfectly, and we are getting these slight delays when we move our object or move our light and then change its intensity. Yeah, that's working really nicely. So you can see how this works. I mean, I'm not going to play around too much because I don't want to waste your time, but you can see how this works. I mean, you can have a good play around with this and do some keyframing of your own, but it just really is quite nice. It's working in quite a natural sort of way. That's what I'm hoping you're seeing here. One thing I will do is if we just select the control, at the moment we've only got a history depth here of 5. Let's intensify this. Let's bring it up to 20, and let's see what happens now. So we'll get a longer delay. Yeah, we get a longer delay. You can see that there's a longer delay before the eye reacts, and that's good. And we can go to 30, of course, and give a really long delay. So let's just try that just to see that it does actually work. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, and so it is doing its job. The actual the history depth from the memory here is actually doing its job. I just wanted to show you that because it's quite important. So again, you can art direct this to your heart's content. You know, do whatever you want to do with it, and just see how you go with it. And it should give you plenty of options. You know, because if you're working with animal eyes, for example, you might get a different reaction time. I mean, I really don't know. I don't know about the anatomy of eyes really, but you know, there may be a different reaction time depending on what type of eye you're actually working with. So, you know, it's something to be thought about, isn't it? But there you go. That's how you do that. But anyway, that just about brings us to the end of the tutorial, because that's really what I wanted to show you. I just wanted to illustrate how this all works with the keyframing there. And you've seen how this is actually done. And it just took 2 relatively simple expressions, nothing too complicated going on in either of these really. You know, it's just basic stuff, nothing too complicated with regard to mathematics. But the memory node, I think, is the thing that really sells it. That's the thing that makes it actually react, I think, in a much more natural way than if we just didn't put that in there. But yeah, I mean, that's how you go about building an eye rig for a human eye. So, as always, I really hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and that you've got something out of it that you can use within your own projects. And if you have enjoyed the video, then please give it a like. And if you haven't already, then please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment and ring the bell. And wherever you happen to be on social media, then please do share this video, because all this good stuff really does help keep the channel moving in the right direction. But anyway, that just about brings the curtain down on this one. So I'll see you very soon on the next tutorial.